The old county courthouse stood like a monument in the center of town, its stone walls weathered by decades of trials, secrets, and verdicts that had shaped the community. That morning, the building seemed unusually alive. Reporters with notepads and cameras lingered outside, eager to capture any hint of what was about to unfold inside. Local residents filed in quietly, some curious, some nervous, all aware that this was not just another trial. Something about today felt different. The tension followed them through the heavy oak doors and into the courtroom itself. The air carried a strange silence, heavy and restless, as if the room itself understood the weight of the moment. Wooden benches creaked as people took their seats, whispering softly to one another, though no one dared to speak too loudly. At the front, the judge adjusted his robe, his face grave with anticipation. The jury shuffled papers, exchanging uneasy glances. Everyone was waiting for one thing, the testimony of a child who had seen more than any child should. The double doors at the back opened slowly. A small figure appeared, holding tightly to the leash of a police dog. The sound of her tiny shoes against the polished floor echoed through the courtroom like a drumbeat. Conversation stopped instantly. All eyes turned. She could not have been more than 8 years old. Her dress, plain and pale blue, seemed a size too big, as though it had been chosen not for style, but comfort. Her thin arms clutched the leash so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Every step looked deliberate, as if she were forcing her feet to move forward, despite the weight of fear pressing down on her small frame. Beside her, a large German shepherd walked calmly, head high, stride steady. The police dog's presence was commanding but gentle. Unlike the cameras, the murmurs, and the stares, the dog seemed unconcerned with the spectacle. His eyes scanned the room, alert and watchful, but his body radiated calmness. The leash was loose. He didn't lead her, and she didn't lead him. They moved as if they were one, the frightened child and the steadfast guardian. Gasps whispered across the courtroom. Some jurors tilted their heads, puzzled. A few spectators exchanged knowing looks, aware that this was no ordinary arrangement. The judge glanced up, his expression unreadable, but he allowed the pair to continue forward. The little girl's steps faltered when she reached the witness stand. For a moment she froze, staring at the wooden chair that seemed far too big for her. It was the same chair where adults, grown men with deep voices and lawyers with sharp suits, had sat to testify in earlier days of the trial. Now it awaited someone small, fragile, and afraid. The bailiff moved closer, ready to help her onto the seat, but the dog shifted first, pressing his body lightly against her legs, as if giving her a gentle nudge. The girl blinked, swallowed hard, and climbed up herself. She perched on the chair awkwardly, her legs dangling above the floor, her shoes swinging nervously. The dog circled once and settled at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half-lidded but watchful. The silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone waited from the corner of the courtroom. The defendant sat at the defense table, his posture rigid. His suit was pressed, his face carefully composed, but his eyes were sharp, cold. The girl did not look at him, not yet. She kept her gaze fixed on the judge's bench, though her fingers trembled as they stroked the dog's fur. Her parents, seated behind her, held their breath, their eyes glistening with worry. The prosecutor approached carefully, as one might approach a wounded bird. His voice was soft, almost fatherly, when he addressed her. "Do you understand why you're here today?" he asked. The girl didn't answer. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. The prosecutor tried again, even softer. "You don't need to be afraid. You're very brave, and all we need is for you to tell the truth. That's all." Still no response. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a middle-aged woman, clasped her hands together as though silently urging the child to speak. Another, a younger man, furrowed his brow, already doubting whether this testimony would happen at all. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly. He had expected this. He had counted on it. A terrified child, unable to speak, meant the case against his client would falter. Seconds dragged into what felt like minutes. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead and the steady breathing of the police dog. The girl's chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes darting between the judge and the floor. She opened her mouth once more, but only managed a shallow gasp. Her hand, small and trembling, reached instinctively for the dog's neck. Her fingers buried themselves in his thick fur, clinging as though she might drown without that anchor. The dog, in turn, lifted his head and pressed it against her arm, steady and sure. The gesture was simple, but it carried a message stronger than words. You're not alone. The judge leaned forward slightly, watching the scene unfold. He did not rush her. He knew that sometimes silence carried more weight than speech. But even he felt the tension stretching thin, threatening to snap. In the gallery, people leaned forward, holding their breath. Reporters scribbled in notepads, but their pens paused mid-sentence, unsure what to write. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a child this young to testify in such a case. It was rarer still to see a courtroom collectively hushed by a silence so fragile, so expectant. At that moment, the trial was no longer about evidence or legal arguments. It wasn't about the prosecutor's strategy or the defense's objections. It wasn't even about the crime itself, not in that instant. All of it faded into the background. The entire weight of justice hung in the balance of one child's courage and the quiet strength of the animal by her side. The prosecutor tried again, his voice even gentler. "Sweetheart," he said, "do you remember the promise you made? To tell the truth?" The girl blinked, her eyes shimmering with tears she refused to let fall. She nodded, just once, barely visible, but enough. A ripple of relief moved through the courtroom. It wasn't a spoken word, but it was a beginning. The defense attorney shifted uneasily now, his earlier confidence dimming. The girl might yet find her voice. The judge looked down from the bench, his gaze steady but kind. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." The girl inhaled shakily, then exhaled. Her small fingers loosened slightly on the dog's fur, though she did not let go. She glanced sideways at the animal, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, her lips curved, the faintest hint of a smile. The dog thumped his tail once against the floor. A tiny sound, but in the stillness, it was deafening. And just like that, something in the girl seemed to shift. The spectators leaned in closer. The jurors straightened in their chairs. The defendant's jaw tightened. Everyone knew the silence would soon be broken, and when it was, the entire case would turn on the words of a child no taller than the witness stand. The story of how the tiny girl ended up in that courtroom began long before she ever touched the police dog's leash. It was a cold spring evening when everything changed. The girl had been sitting by the window of her small home on the edge of town, coloring in a notebook while her mother washed dishes in the kitchen. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of American suburb where nothing unusual seemed to happen. Streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. Then she saw him. At first, it seemed ordinary. A man walking quickly, his coat pulled tight around him, his face half hidden in the dim light. But something about his movements unsettled her. He wasn't walking with purpose, like the neighbors she knew. He was lingering, pausing every few steps, his head turning as if to check whether anyone was watching. She leaned closer to the glass, her crayon forgotten in her lap. Her young eyes were sharper than most adults gave her credit for. And what she saw next made her blood run cold. The man slipped into the alley across the street, and when he reappeared, he wasn't alone. A second figure followed, and the two men exchanged something she couldn't see clearly. A glint of metal caught the faint light before disappearing into a pocket dot. It was the kind of detail that would escape most children. But she noticed, moments later, there was a noise, sharp, sudden, violent. Her mother rushed into the room, alarmed, but by the time she pulled the curtains shut, the girl had already seen too much. The man's face burned into her memory. The way his jaw clenched, the shadow of stubble, the intensity in his eyes. That night, police sirens shattered the silence of their neighborhood. News spread quickly. A crime had taken place not far from their home. A man was attacked, and though he survived, his injuries were severe. Witnesses were scarce. Few had seen anything in the darkness. But one little girl had doubted first. No one believed her. She was just a child, after all. What could she possibly know about crime, about danger, about the complexities of grown-up violence? Yet when detectives visited her house and showed her a series of photos, her small finger pointed unerringly to the suspect. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. The room fell silent. The man she identified was no stranger to the police. He had a record, though he had always managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. Now, with the girl's account, investigators finally had a witness who could place him at the scene. But there was a problem. Every time the girl was asked to repeat her story, she grew quieter. In the safety of her home, she would whisper details to her parents. But the moment a uniformed officer appeared, her lips sealed shut. The memory of the man's cold stare haunted her dreams. She feared that if she spoke too loudly, he would somehow hear her, that he would find her, even behind the locked doors of her bedroom. Her parents worried. The prosecutor worried. Without her testimony, the case was weak. Forensic evidence was limited, circumstantial at best. The victim remembered little of the attack. Neighbors claimed they saw shadows, but couldn't identify faces. It all came down to her, an 8-year-old with eyes too innocent for such responsibility, was when the idea of the police dog entered the story. The county had recently begun training a new type of canine, unlike drug sniffing or search dogs. These animals were trained to provide emotional support in high-stress situations. They were gentle, steady, and unshakable, able to calm children who had endured trauma. The program was experimental, and many courts resisted the idea. But the prosecutor believed this girl was the perfect candidate. Her parents hesitated at first. A courtroom was no place for their daughter, they argued. Couldn't her testimony be recorded on video? Couldn't someone else speak for her? But the law was clear. For the testimony to hold the greatest weight, she needed to appear in person. It was unfair, perhaps even cruel, but the system demanded her presence. Finally, they agreed, though their hearts ached. They watched as the police introduced their daughter to the German Shepherd, who would one day sit at her feet in the courtroom. At first, she recoiled, frightened by his size. But within minutes, the bond formed. The dog lay on the ground, rolling onto his back, inviting her to scratch his belly. She giggled, the first sound of joy her parents had heard from her in weeks. From then on, she rarely let go of his leash. The defense, of course, fought back. They argued that a dog would unfairly influence the jury, making the girl appear more sympathetic. "It's a trick," the attorney sneered during pre-trial motions. A calculated move to manipulate emotions. But the judge was not swayed. He had seen the reports, heard the girl's hesitations, and recognized that her fear was real. "This child is not here to manipulate," he said firmly. "She is here to speak the truth. And if the presence of a dog helps her do that, then so be it." The ruling made headlines. Some praised the decision as compassionate and forward-thinking. Others called it a dangerous precedent, claiming emotions had no place in the courtroom. But in the end, It didn't matter what the paper said. What mattered was that a child who had seen too much was given a chance to be heard. On the morning of the trial, as the courthouse filled with reporters and townsfolk, the girl stood quietly in the hallway with her parents. The dog sat beside her, tail gently sweeping the floor. Her small hand rested on his head, her eyes wide with dread. Her mother knelt beside her. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. "He's here. We're here. And the truth is stronger than fear." The bailiff appeared, signaling it was time. The girl's stomach churned, but when the dog stood and nudged her forward, she followed. Together they walked toward the heavy doors of the courtroom. And that was how the scene began. A tiny girl, a loyal dog, and a room full of strangers, waiting to hear whether her small voice could tip the scales of justice. What none of them knew was that her testimony, or lack of it, would soon decide everything. The defense table was a fortress of polished wood and paper stacks, behind which sat three men in suits, their expressions a blend of skepticism and calculation. They had seen cases like this before, cases that leaned heavily on emotion, on sympathy, on the hope that a jury would be moved by heartstrings rather than hard facts. From the moment the prosecution requested the presence of a police K-9 beside the little girl, the defense had bristled. To them, it wasn't justice. It was theater. "This is a circus act," one attorney snapped during pretrial hearings, his voice echoing in the nearly empty courtroom. The presence of a dog serves no purpose other than to prejudice the jury. It suggests the child is fragile, that she's telling the truth simply because she's scared. That is not evidence. That is emotional manipulation. He paced as he spoke, gesturing wildly with his hands, his polished shoes clapping against the tile. He was a man known for his flair, for turning arguments into performances, and he believed this one was airtight. To him, the idea of a child with a dog testifying was laughable and dangerous, but the prosecutor refused to back down. Calm, steady, and unyielding, he countered, "The witness is a minor, and she has endured significant trauma." Courts across this country have allowed therapy dogs to accompany children during testimony in cases of abuse and violence. This is not a stunt. This is necessity. Without the dog, she may not be able to speak at all. The judge, a man with more years of experience than either side combined, leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. He had heard both sides, weighed both arguments. He had no patience for theatrics, yet he also had no tolerance for silencing a child who carried the truth. After a long pause, he ruled. "The request is granted. The dog will be permitted." The defense team erupted, filing immediate objections and motions. They sent letters, made phone calls, anything to overturn the decision. But every appeal failed. The judge's word held. The girl would walk into court with her four-legged companion, and the jury would see them together. When word spread through town, reactions were mixed. Some praised the decision as compassionate, applauding the judge for valuing the child's courage. Others scoffed, muttering that the case had turned into a spectacle. What's next? One critic sneered on a local radio show. Clowns in the jury box? Therapy cats on the bench? But for the defense team, the outrage was fuel. They leaned on it, sharpening their strategy. If they couldn't keep the dog out of the courtroom, they would use its presence against the prosecution. "We'll show the jury what this really is," the lead attorney told his colleagues. A ploy, a calculated move to distract from the fact that their entire case hinges on the shaky memory of a terrified 8-year-old. They dug deep into every detail of the child's life. They scoured her school records, her family background, her psychological evaluations. They rehearsed their cross-examination questions with surgical precision. Their goal was not to attack her outright. That would backfire. Instead, they planned to plant seeds of doubt. If they could show the jury that the girl's fear distorted her memory, or that the dog's presence was orchestrated to make her appear credible, they could dismantle the prosecution's case. In quiet moments, away from the courtroom lights, the defense attorneys argued late into the night. Some worried about optics. Cross-examining a child was dangerous. Too aggressive, and they would look cruel. Too gentle, and she might slip through with her story intact. But the lead attorney was confident. He had faced worse odds before. Juries are emotional, he admitted. But they're also skeptical. All we need is one juror who hesitates, one who thinks, maybe she's confused. Maybe the dog made her braver than she really is. That hesitation is enough. Meanwhile, the defendant himself sat quietly during these discussions, his face a mask of calm. But his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with anger whenever the girl's name was mentioned. He leaned close to his lawyers, his voice a low growl. "She won't hold up," he muttered. "She's just a kid. She'll freeze." It was the same belief that gave the defense their confidence, that fear would paralyze her, and the jury would see her as unreliable. But deep inside, a sliver of doubt gnawed at them. Children, unpredictable as storms, sometimes found strength in places no one expected. The day before the girl's testimony, the defense gathered one last time in their office, stacks of legal pads spread across the table. They rehearsed their strategy, step by step. First, they would object to her entrance with the dog, forcing the judge to reaffirm his ruling in front of the jury. That alone would plant the idea that the arrangement was questionable. Then, during questioning, they would focus on inconsistencies in her story, small gaps in memory, moments when she hesitated, details she might not recall clearly. They didn't need to discredit her entirely. They only needed to weaken her enough that the jury doubted her certainty. "Remember," the lead attorney reminded them, "our client is innocent until proven guilty. If she falters, if she so much as says, 'I don't remember,' we win." That night, the courthouse loomed in silence under the glow of street lamps. Inside, janitors cleaned the marble floors, preparing for the morning rush. The defense lawyers left their office late, their suits wrinkled, their eyes heavy, but their confidence intact. They believed they were ready. The next morning, as the courtroom filled, their strategy was put to the test. The defendant sat stiffly in his chair, adjusting his tie, his eyes fixed on the double doors. His attorneys leaned in, whispering last-minute reminders, rehearsed objections at the ready. When the doors finally opened, and the girl appeared with the German Shepherd at her side, the defense table stirred. "Objection, Your Honor." The lead attorney barked instantly, rising to his feet. "This is prejudicial to the jury." The courtroom froze, eyes darting between the dog, the girl, and the judge. The judge's gavel cracked once. "Objection overruled. The witness will proceed." A ripple of murmurs spread across the gallery. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. He sat down, his mind racing. The tactic hadn't worked. Now it was on to the next phase. They had to wait. They had to watch. And they had to strike the moment the girl's fear cracked through her fragile courage. But as she sat in the chair, her tiny hand resting on the dog's fur, a flicker of unease passed through even the most confident of the defense team. Because for all their planning, all their strategy, they could not predict what would happen when the girl finally spoke. The courtroom was unusually still when the little girl finally climbed onto the witness chair. For a moment, the entire room seemed frozen in place, as though time itself had stopped to watch her. She looked impossibly small against the vast wooden seat, her legs dangling above the polished floor, her hands gripping the edges as if holding on for balance. Beside her, the German Shepherd settled into his post with quiet dignity. His body stretched out across the floor, his head resting between his paws, yet his eyes remained open, alert. Every few seconds, his ears twitched, catching the smallest noises, the shuffle of papers, the creak of benches, the faint hum of fluorescent lights. But mostly, he kept his gaze fixed on the girl, as though reminding her she was not alone. The prosecutor approached slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. His suit jacket brushed against the table as he leaned just slightly, lowering his voice to the softness one might use with a child at bedtime. "Do you remember me?" he asked gently. The girl nodded once, her chin dipping so slightly it might have been mistaken for a twitch. "And do you remember why you're here?" he continued, his words paced, deliberate, free of the heavy legal jargon he used with adults. She shifted in her seat, her small fingers sliding into the dog's fur. Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to muffle the very air. The jurors leaned forward instinctively, their eyes narrowing, searching her face for any sign of sound. In the gallery, someone coughed nervously, quickly stifling the noise. Even the judge, usually composed and impassive, tilted his head slightly, as though urging her on with nothing more than his gaze. But still, she said nothing. Seconds stretched like hours. The prosecutor's encouraging smile faltered slightly before he composed himself again. "That's all right," he said softly. "Take your time. There's no rush." The girl lowered her eyes to her lap, her shoulders curling inward. For a moment, she looked less like a witness and more like a child lost in a room far too big for her. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her breath shallow and uneven. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney allowed himself the faintest of smirks. This was exactly what he had expected. Children were unpredictable, fragile, easily intimidated. He leaned toward his client and whispered something, and though the words were inaudible to the rest, the defendant's cold smile revealed their meaning. The defendant's eyes locked onto the girl like daggers. He didn't move, but his stare was unrelenting, dark and heavy with menace. Perhaps it was only imagination, but the girl seemed to shrink under its weight, her body stiffening as though she could feel the heat of his gaze, even from across the room. The silence deepened. The jurors began shifting uneasily, exchanging uncertain glances. One of them, a man with graying hair, folded his arms and sighed quietly, already wondering if this testimony was going to crumble before it even began. Another, a younger woman in the front row, chewed her lip, torn between sympathy and doubt. The prosecutor tried again. "You're very brave, sweetheart. Remember, all you need to do is tell the truth. That's all we're asking." Still nothing. Her tiny hand dug deeper into the German shepherd's fur, clutching so tightly the dog's skin rippled beneath her grip. The dog remained perfectly calm, his breathing steady, his eyes half-lidded as though meditating. After a few moments, he shifted slightly, pressing his shoulder against her leg in a subtle gesture of reassurance. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but it seemed to ripple through her like a spark. She blinked, her lashes damp with unshed tears, and for the first time since sitting down, she lifted her head. Her eyes didn't go to the prosecutor. They didn't go to the judge or the jury, or even her parents sitting nervously behind her. Instead, they darted directly to the defendant. The room seemed to hold its breath. A man sat rigid, his expression carefully blank, but his eyes, those cold, piercing eyes, glared at her with a silent warning. Her lips quivered, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. For a moment, it looked as though she might crumble under the pressure, her voice swallowed forever by fear. Then she tore her gaze away and looked down at the dog. His steady presence, so calm and unshaken, anchored her. Her small fingers loosened their desperate grip and began to stroke his fur instead. Slowly, her shoulders lowered, her breathing steadied, and her trembling eased. The silence, though still unbroken, had shifted. It no longer felt suffocating. It felt waiting. The prosecutor's eyes flickered with renewed hope. He glanced at the judge, then back to the girl. He didn't speak again, sensing that words would only disrupt what was happening. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture of encouragement, and stepped back slightly to give her space. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Take your time, young lady. Whenever you're ready." The girl inhaled deeply, the sound small but audible in the hushed courtroom. Her lips parted again, and though no sound came yet, the shift in her posture was unmistakable. She was preparing. In the gallery, a woman pressed her hands together tightly, whispering a silent prayer. Reporters clutched their pens, ready to capture whatever came next. A jury leaned in closer, the weight of anticipation visible on their faces. The defendant, however, shifted uneasily for the first time. His composure cracked, just slightly, as he realized the silence was no longer his ally. It wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence before a storm. The dog lifted his head, pressing it gently into the girl's hand. Her fingers curled instinctively around his ear, and with that simple gesture, the tide began to turn. The moment stretched, the silence pulsed, and the courtroom leaned as one toward the tiny girl in the oversized chair. Everyone knew that whatever words came next, whether a whisper, a cry, or a simple yes or no, would carry more weight than any argument, any piece of evidence, or any lawyer's speech. And in that breathless silence, the little girl opened her mouth to speak. The air inside the courtroom felt impossibly thick, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Every eye was fixed on the tiny girl, perched on the oversized witness chair, her hand resting firmly in the thick fur of the German shepherd at her side. For minutes that stretched like eternity, she had been silent, trapped between the enormity of fear and the fragile thread of courage. And then it happened. Her lips trembled once. Her throat worked as though she were swallowing back a stone. And suddenly, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, two words broke the silence. "He did." The sound seemed small at first, almost delicate, but it rang across the room like a crack of thunder. The courtroom erupted with a collective gasp. Several jurors sat straighter, their eyes wide, as though jolted awake from a dream. The gallery rippled with murmurs. The words, "She spoke," and "Did you hear that?" floating like fragments of electricity. Even the court clerk, who had been scribbling notes in a detached rhythm, froze with her pen suspended mid-air. The defendant, sitting rigidly at the defense table, stiffened. His jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed in his temple, and though he tried to mask it, the brief flicker of panic in his eyes betrayed him. The defense attorney quickly leaned over, whispering frantically, but the damage was already done. Those two words, so simple, so undeniable, had shifted the gravity of the room. The prosecutor allowed himself a small breath of relief. He had been patient, careful not to press her too hard, but deep inside he had feared she might never summon the strength to speak. Now, with just 2 syllables, she had not only spoken, she had confirmed the very heart of the case. Still, he knew better than to rush. The girl's courage was delicate, like a flame that could sputter out if too much wind pressed against it. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to her eye level, his voice soft but steady. "Sweetheart, can you tell us who did it?" he asked gently. Her eyes darted to the defendant, then back down to the dog. The German shepherd gave a subtle shift, leaning closer, his warm body pressed against her leg. She stroked his fur in short, nervous bursts, then inhaled shakily. Her voice quivered, but it carried. "He did. That man." She lifted her tiny hand and pointed directly at the defendant. The room seemed to tilt. For the jurors, there was no mistaking the impact of what they had just witnessed. The smallest, most vulnerable person in the room had just stood up metaphorically, if not physically, to the most intimidating figure there. It wasn't just an accusation. It was courage distilled into 2 words, in a single trembling gesture. The defense attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, his voice cracking louder than intended. "She's being coached." This is highly prejudicial. The judge slammed his gavel once, the sharp crack echoing. Sit down, counselor. Overruled. The defense attorney hesitated, his mouth still open to argue, but the stern look from the bench silenced him. With a frustrated sigh, he sank back into his chair, his jaw tight. The little girl's hand still lingered in the dog's fur. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly toward her, his steady brown eyes radiating reassurance. It was as if the animal himself knew what had just happened, that those two words had shifted the course of all. Justice. The prosecutor straightened slowly, his expression respectful rather than triumphant. He knew better than to celebrate in front of her. This wasn't a victory lap, it was a moment of trust. Thank you, he said softly, almost as if speaking only to her. That was very brave. The judge addressed the jury, his tone grave. Let the record show that the witness has identified the defendant. The stenographer's keys clicked rapidly, capturing history in the making. But the girl wasn't finished. Her lips parted again, her voice steadier now, as though speaking the truth had given her strength rather than drained it. He hurt people. I saw him. I remember. Her words spilled out haltingly, but clearly. Each syllable felt like another brick in the wall being built against the defendant's defense. Gasps echoed again from the gallery. A woman near the back dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A man shook his head slowly, whispering to the person beside him, I can't believe how strong she is. The defendant's composure cracked further. His foot tapped rapidly under the table, his fingers drumming in a restless beat. No matter how he tried to appear unaffected, the unease was written across his features. The dog, sensing the tension, lifted his head fully now, eyes fixed on the defendant as if he, too, was silently testifying with the child. The room felt united in that gaze, human and animal. Jury and spectators, every soul locked on the man accused. The prosecutor decided it was enough for the moment. He didn't want to push her into reliving too much pain at once. Her simple testimony, those two devastating words, followed by the unmistakable identification, was powerful enough to reverberate. Your Honor, he said quietly, I have no further questions at this time. The judge nodded. Very well. The defense may cross-examine. The defense attorney rose, straightened his jacket, and approached the witness stand with forced calm. He knew the jury had just witnessed something unforgettable, but he was determined to plant seeds of doubt. He crouched slightly, his tone sugar-coated. Hello there, he began, his smile thin. You're very brave for coming here today. The girl didn't respond. Her hand never left the dog's fur. You said. He did, the attorney continued, his voice lilting as though he were coaxing a child into admitting a fib. But you know, sometimes when people are scared, they can make mistakes. Isn't it possible that you're mistaken? The girl's eyes lifted, and for the first time, she didn't look frightened. She looked steady. No, I know what I saw. The attorney blinked, thrown by the firmness in her tone. He tried again. But it was dark that night, wasn't it? Maybe you couldn't see clearly? The girl leaned closer to the dog, her small body brushing against his warmth. I saw his face. I remember. It was him. The dog's ears flicked, his head lowering back onto his paws, as if punctuating her words with quiet finality. The defense attorney faltered. For once, his carefully rehearsed tactics seemed useless against the simple, unwavering honesty of a child who had already endured more than she should. He straightened, sighed, and turned back toward the judge. No further questions. The little girl relaxed slightly, her tiny shoulders lowering. She leaned down, pressing her cheek briefly against the dog's head. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stayed, her silent anchor in the storm knot. And with that, the two words she had spoken, he did, echoed in every corner of the courtroom, in the minds of every juror, and in the heart of justice itself. The silence following the defense attorney's retreat was heavy, but this time it was different. It was no longer the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of something new being born. For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, the little girl did not look like she wanted to disappear. She sat taller, one hand tangled in the thick fur of the police dog at her side, the other resting on the arm of the chair. Her eyes, though still shimmering with nervous tears, were steadier now, as though a light had been switched on inside her. The prosecutor, recognizing the shift, stepped forward again. His tone was cautious, but encouraging. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "you've already been so brave. If you feel ready, can you tell us what you remember from that night?" The girl's lower lip trembled, but this time she did not retreat into silence. She looked down at the dog, who lifted his head and nudged her arm gently with his nose, as if urging her forward. She stroked his ear, inhaled deeply, and began. At first her words came haltingly, like drops of rain before a storm. I was in my room. I heard shouting outside. It was really loud. The courtroom leaned in as one. Jurors shifted forward in their seats. Pencils paused over notepads. Reporters in the gallery froze mid-scribble, their eyes wide. The judge himself leaned ever so slightly forward, his expression unreadable but intent. The girl continued, her voice gathering strength. I looked out the window. I saw him. She pointed again at the defendant, who sat rigid, his face pale. He was yelling. And then he hurt someone. He pushed them down. They were crying. He didn't stop. A ripple of sound spread across the room, gasps, murmurs, the sharp intake of breath from strangers who had not expected such clarity from such a small voice. Her hands clenched briefly in the dog's fur, but instead of freezing, she pressed forward. Her words grew faster, steadier, as though the dam inside her had finally cracked open, and everything she had been holding back came rushing through. He hit them again and again. I wanted to scream, but I was scared. He looked up once. He looked right at me through the window. I ducked down so he wouldn't see me, but I knew he knew I was there. The jurors exchanged glances. The woman in the front row, who had been chewing her lip earlier, now had tears streaming down her cheeks. The man with graying hair shook his head in disbelief, scribbling furiously in the margins of his notebook. The prosecutor nodded gently, encouraging her without rushing. You're doing so well. What happened next? Her eyes closed briefly, her lashes damp, but she forced herself onward. Then I heard a loud noise. He kicked the door. He went inside. I could hear people screaming. I didn't know what to do. Her voice cracked, and for a moment she seemed ready to crumble. But the German shepherd nudged her hand again, and when she opened her eyes, they shone with fresh determination. I ran to my mom. I told her. She called the police. But when they came, it was too late for some of them. Her voice lowered, trembling, but it carried through the hushed courtroom. I saw him leave. He was laughing. He didn't even care. Gasps echoed through the room again, sharper this time, laced with outrage. The defendant shifted uneasily, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. But the jurors were no longer watching him. They were watching her. The prosecutor's voice was calm, but beneath it pulsed quiet intensity. Sweetheart, you're doing exactly what you came here to do. You're telling the truth. Do you remember what he was wearing that night? She nodded quickly, eager now, as though each answer gave her strength. Yes, a dark jacket, with a tear on the sleeve. He had boots, too. Big boots. I could hear them on the pavement. The prosecutor gestured to the evidence table. Members of the jury, you will note that a torn black jacket and boots matching this description were recovered from the defendant's residence. The defense attorney shot to his feet. Objection. She's just a child. Her memory could be tainted. The judge's gavel cracked. Overruled. The jury will decide the credibility of her testimony. The little girl pressed on, her voice gaining volume. I saw his hands. They were covered in red. He wiped them on his pants. He didn't think anyone was watching. But I saw it. The courtroom erupted again in gasps, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads. The stenographer's keys clattered furiously as she struggled to keep pace. The prosecutor lowered his voice, speaking almost in reverence. And you're certain, sweetheart? You're certain it was him? Her eyes locked onto the defendant's once more, and this time she did not look away. Yes, I'll never forget his face. It was him. The defendant finally broke. He shifted violently in his chair, slamming his palm against the table. She's lying, he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. She doesn't know what she saw. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. Order! Order in this courtroom! Bailiffs moved quickly to restrain the outburst, one hand on the defendant's shoulder, forcing him back into his seat. The outburst, though quickly contained, only sealed the impression in the minds of the jurors. The little girl had sat small and steady, her voice trembling but honest. The defendant had erupted in anger, confirming the menace she had described. The girl flinched at the sudden noise, but the German shepherd pressed closer, shielding her with his body. She leaned against him, tears sliding down her cheeks, but she did not look broken. She looked relieved. For the first time, she had spoken her truth out loud, and the world had listened. The prosecutor stepped back, his voice quiet but ringing with finality. Your Honor, I believe the jury has now heard the truth. No further questions. The judge studied the girl for a long moment. His usually impassive face softened slightly, the corners of his mouth dipping in something close to respect. You've done a very brave thing today, he said solemnly. This court thanks you. The jurors were still transfixed. Some scribbled furiously, but most simply stared at her in awe. The smallest voice in the room had just spoken the loudest truth. The bailiff approached gently, offering to escort her out, but the girl shook her head, her hand still clinging to the dog. She wanted to leave with him, the one who had given her strength when she thought she had none. The judge granted it, allowing the canine officer to rise and accompany her as she walked past the jury box. Holding tightly to the leash, heads turned to follow her. A few jurors even smiled softly through their tears, silently acknowledging the courage they had just witnessed. And as she exited the courtroom, whispers rose in her wake, not of doubt, but of admiration. The truth had come, not in legal arguments or forensic evidence, but in the trembling words of a child and the steadfast presence of a dog. The avalanche had begun, and nothing could stop it now. The heavy doors of the courtroom swung closed behind the little girl and the German shepherd, their footsteps fading down the corridor. Yet even in her absence, her voice lingered. The words he did seemed etched into the very wood of the walls, into the air that hung thick above the jury box. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was not the hesitant quiet from before. This was a silence of awe, of processing, of reckoning. The judge finally broke it. His gavel tapped once, not in anger, but in finality. Let the record show, he intoned, that the testimony of the witness has been given and entered. The jurors were still shaken. Some leaned back, visibly trying to steady themselves, while others bent over their notepads as though writing might anchor them to reality. A woman in the front row dabbed her cheeks with a tissue. The older man with graying hair rubbed his jaw, deep in thought. Before scribbling something he underlined twice. The prosecutor remained standing, his expression respectful. He knew what had just unfolded was more powerful than any closing statement he could ever deliver. He had prepared months of evidence, documents, photos, forensic reports, but none of it carried the same weight as the small child who had just stared down her fear and spoken truth. Defense attorney, however, was a different story. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he shuffled his papers. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but even his voice betrayed him when he rose. "Your Honor," he began, forcing steadiness. "The defense moves to strike the child's testimony on the grounds of unreliability. She is young, impressionable, and her account is clearly colored by fear." The judge's gaze was sharp. "Motion denied. The jury will consider her testimony in context, with all evidence provided." Defense attorney's lips pressed into a thin line. He had expected as much, but protocol required the attempt. Still, the damage was done. The jurors had not only heard the little girl, they had felt her. And feelings, once planted, were impossible to uproot with technical objections. The defendant himself sat stiffly, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. He kept his eyes fixed downward, as though the linoleum beneath his feet might open a hole and swallow him whole. The outburst he had unleashed earlier replayed in the minds of the jurors, his fury, his loss of control, and now it stood in stark contrast to the child's fragile honesty. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Your Honor," he said, turning toward the bench, "with the court's permission, I would like to recall the officer who first responded to the scene, to corroborate the details provided by the witness." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The officer took the stand, his testimony calm, methodical. He confirmed the timeline, the call from the child's mother, the state of the victims when he arrived, the evidence collected. Piece by piece, the puzzle aligned perfectly with the child's account. Her small, trembling voice now had the backing of cold, hard fact. The jurors listened with a new level of intensity. Before, they had approached the case with cautious detachment, as jurors are trained to do. But after the girl's testimony, the trial no longer felt like abstract legal procedure. It was real. It was raw. And they were part of something that mattered. When the officer stepped down, the defense attorney attempted to call his own witnesses, but the momentum had shifted. Their testimonies felt thin, rehearsed, even hollow in comparison. The jurors' faces showed polite attention, but their eyes betrayed impatience. The defense was grasping, and everyone knew it. The prosecutor reserved his energy, choosing not to grandstand. He didn't need theatrics. The child had already provided the heart of the case. Instead, he simply reinforced the facts, tying the evidence to the testimony with deliberate clarity. As the day wound down, the judge announced a recess before closing arguments. The jurors were escorted out, their faces drawn and thoughtful. Reporters rushed from the gallery, phones pressed to ears, ready to broadcast the story that was already making headlines. Child's testimony stuns courtroom. Inside, the prosecutor gathered his files with quiet efficiency. He had seen strong witnesses before, experts, officers, survivors, but never had he witnessed such raw courage from someone so small. He paused for a moment, picturing the girl walking hand in hand with the dog, and felt a surge of something rare in his profession. Hope. The defense attorney, on the other hand, collapsed into his chair with a sigh that rattled with frustration. He rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath, while his client hissed angrily beside him. "You said she wouldn't talk," the defendant spat, his voice low but sharp. "You said she'd freeze." The attorney shot him a glare. "I said she might." "You underestimated her." "We all did." The defendant swore under his breath, slamming his fist lightly against the table. The bailiff's eyes narrowed, stepping closer. The man forced himself back into his seat, but the seething in his expression was unmistakable. When the court recessed for the day, whispers followed everyone into the hallways. Attorneys, clerks, even strangers spoke in hushed tones about the little girl and the German shepherd who had given her strength. "Did you see her point at him?" One woman whispered. She didn't even hesitate at the end. She was shaking the whole time, another replied, but she still did it. My God, what courage! The story spread like wildfire, the courthouse buzzing with retellings and interpretations. Even those who had doubted whether she could withstand the pressure found themselves converted. Back inside the nearly empty courtroom, the judge lingered at the bench for a moment, his robe swaying as he rose. He had presided over countless cases, heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses, but few moments had left such an imprint. He set down his gavel slowly, almost reverently, before retiring to his chambers. For the jurors, the walk back to their deliberation room was heavy with reflection. Though they were forbidden to discuss the case until instructed, their silence spoke volumes. Each carried with them the image of the little girl, clutching the dog's fur, staring down a man twice her size and 4 times her age, and saying the words that had cracked the case wide open. The court stenographer, usually detached, found her hands trembling as she reviewed her notes. The keys had captured the words precisely, but no transcript could ever truly convey the weight with which they had been spoken. And so, as the sun dipped lower outside the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors, the aftermath of her testimony settled like dust after a storm. Everyone inside that building knew the trial had changed. The case no longer hinged on speculation or legal maneuvering. It hinged on the 2 simplest words ever spoken in that courtroom. He did. Those words, spoken by the smallest voice, had become the loudest echo. The courthouse was quiet now, empty of the clamor that had filled it during the trial. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden benches where hours earlier the courtroom had held the weight of fear, truth, and courage. Outside, reporters lingered in groups, whispering and scribbling, but inside, only the echoes remained of a tiny girl whose words had shaken the walls. Little girl sat with her parents in a small waiting area, the German shepherd resting his massive head on her lap. She stroked his fur absently, her small fingers smoothing the thick coat while her eyes wandered to the courthouse doors. She had done what she never thought possible. She had spoken, faced her fear, and given the world a truth that could no longer be ignored. Her mother's hand covered hers, warm and steady. You were amazing, she whispered, voice trembling. No one can ever take that courage away from you. Her father nodded, pride shining through his exhaustion. You helped make the world a little safer today. You helped bring justice. The girl's lips quivered, but she didn't speak. Words had come hard enough in the courtroom. Now, relief and pride mingled in a quiet storm inside her chest. The news spread almost immediately. By the afternoon, headlines across the city and even the nation told the story. Tiny girl stands before police dog in court, says just 2 words, justice follows. Social media erupted with stories of her bravery. Hashtags celebrated her courage, the dog, and the undeniable power of truth told by the smallest among us. People from all corners sent letters, emails, and gifts to her family, praising her for standing strong when it mattered most. But for her, it wasn't about attention or praise. It had never been. It had been about doing what was right, no matter how small or scared she felt. The defendant, meanwhile, faced consequences that were swift and uncompromising. The jury, still reverberating with the impact of her testimony, returned a guilty verdict within hours of deliberation. His protests, his defense, his carefully rehearsed arguments, none of it mattered. The truth, carried by an 8-year-old girl and bolstered by the loyal presence of a dog, had prevailed. The courtroom erupted once more, this time in a different way. Tears, relieved sighs, whispered congratulations. The atmosphere was electric, not with fear, but with resolution. For the first time in months, the victims of the crime felt some measure of closure. They would carry scars for life, but the guilty had been held accountable. The little girl, escorted quietly by her parents and the police officer who had been her steadfast guide, walked past reporters and well-wishers. The German shepherd, alert and calm, walked beside her, tail low but wagging slightly, sensing that the trial was over and that his job as protector was complete. Months passed after the trial, and the girl's story continued to resonate. Her bravery inspired programs for children who might one day face their own fears in court. Law enforcement agencies began expanding canine support programs, ensuring that other children could have the same strength and comfort that had helped her speak out at school. She became something of a quiet legend. Her classmates whispered about the tiny girl who had faced danger and told the truth in front of dozens of adults, judges, and jurors. Teachers used her story as an example of courage, resilience, and integrity. And though she sometimes wished she could just be a normal child again, she carried her experience with a quiet pride. The German shepherd, now officially recognized as her canine companion, remained a constant presence. He went everywhere with her home, school, and even visits to the courthouse for community events. The bond between them deepened, a living symbol of loyalty and protection. People often stopped to ask about him, and she would smile, fingers still running through his fur, and reply simply, "He helped me." The girl's parents also noticed a change in her. Once shy and hesitant, she now spoke with a newfound confidence, in small ways answering questions in class, raising her hand in meetings, helping younger children who were scared or shy. The courage she had summoned in the courtroom had not vanished. It had become a part of her, shaping her into someone stronger, more determined. The defendant's sentencing was widely publicized. Though he had attempted to intimidate and manipulate, the jury's decision reflected the undeniable truth of what had transpired. He received the maximum sentence, a reminder to the community that actions have consequences, and that even the smallest voice, when honest and brave, could make a difference in the course of justice. Years later, the little girl, still small for her age, but resilient in spirit, would return to the courthouse not as a witness, but as a speaker at an event honoring children who had assisted in legal proceedings. She would tell her story once more, standing in front of a room full of people who were eager to learn, listen, and be inspired. And always, the German shepherd, older now, graying at the muzzle, would sit by her side, a living testament to courage, loyalty, and the bond between child and protector. Her story became more than just a courtroom moment. It became a symbol that bravery isn't measured in size, that truth isn't defined by age, and that even the smallest among us can shape the world in unimaginable ways. Communities used her story to teach children about integrity, resilience, and the power of speaking up. Legal institutions examined ways to better protect young witnesses, and schools developed programs to help children find courage in difficult circumstances. But beyond all accolades, beyond the headlines and awards, she remained simply herself, a child who had faced fear, who had stared danger in the eye, and who had said the words that mattered most. Her courage was quiet, steady, and transformative, like the pulse of a heart that refuses to yield. And in the quiet moments, when the courthouse was empty, when reporters were gone and cameras turned off, the little girl would sit with her dog at her side, fingers running through his fur, whispering softly, "Thank you," for the dog had been more than a companion. He had been a shield, a comfort, and a witness to her bravery. Together, they had changed the course of a case, restored faith in justice, and shown a community that courage can come from the most unexpected places. And that, perhaps, was the most enduring lesson of all, that even the tiniest voice, paired with steadfast support, can resonate far beyond the walls of a courtroom, leaving a legacy that shapes hearts, minds, and a society that chooses to believe in the power of truth.